I sat at the kitchen table the morning my daughter found the old passbook, and I already knew what was coming. "Dad, this account has nothing in it," Aisha said, holding the worn blue booklet like evidence in a trial. "Zero balance. Why do you even keep this?" My son-in-law Farhan laughed from the couch without looking up from his phone. "Probably forgot to close it. Old habits, right?" I didn't answer. I never did when they talked about me like I wasn't in the room. It had started small, the way these things always do. A comment here, a sigh there. 6 months ago my wife Ruxana passed, and since then, Aisha insisted I move in with her family, instead of staying alone in the house her mother and I had built our whole life around. I agreed, thinking it would bring us closer. Instead, I watched myself become a line item in their monthly budget, a subject of quiet calculations at dinner, a shape in the corner of every conversation about money. "He doesn't even have a pension that covers much," I heard Farhan tell his brother on the phone one evening, not bothering to lower his voice. "We're basically supporting him." I stood in the hallway with a glass of water in my hand and let the words pass through me like wind through an open window. Ruxana used to say, I had the patience of a mountain. I never felt the truth of that more than in those months. My grandson Zain was the only one who still looked at me the way a child looks at someone he trusts completely. He'd climb onto my lap in the evenings and ask me to tell him about the farm I grew up on, about the 2 years I spent working construction in Dubai before he was even born, about the small shop I once ran that sold radios and clocks. He never once asked how much money was in my account. The passbook Aisha found that morning belonged to an account I opened in 1994. It was empty, yes, because it had been converted, years ago, into something else entirely. But I said nothing, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because I had learned long before that explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are rarely changes anything. It only invites more scrutiny, more doubt. "Dad, seriously," Aisha pressed, setting the passbook down. "Why do you carry this around like it means something?" "It reminds me of your mother," I said quietly. That much was true. Ruxana had stood beside me the day I opened it, in a bank that no longer exists under that name. She softened for a moment, the way she sometimes still did when her mother came up. Then Farhan cleared his throat. "We should talk about the guest room, actually. My cousin's family is coming next month for the wedding season. We might need the space." I understood what he meant, even if he didn't say it directly. I nodded slowly. "I can go stay at Imran's for a few weeks," I offered, naming an old friend 2 streets over. "That would help a lot, actually," Aisha said, relief evident in her voice, and something in my chest tightened, not from anger, but from the quiet ache of realizing how easily I had become a problem to be solved, rather than a father to be kept close. That night I sat with Zain on the porch, and he asked me why I looked tired. I told him it was nothing, just an old man's thoughts. He rested his head against my arm and said, "Nana, when I grow up, I want a shop like the one you had, with the radios." I smiled and said maybe I'd help him build one someday. He didn't know how close to true that promise already was. 3 days later, a man named Wasim called my phone. I hadn't heard from him in almost 11 years. He introduced himself carefully, the way lawyers do when they're not certain how much the other person remembers. "Uncle, I'm calling about the trust your brother set up before he passed. There have been some developments with the property in Sialkot and with the account in Geneva. We need you to come in and sign some updated documents." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed. My younger brother Tariq had left the country in 1988 and built a textile export business in Europe that none of us, not even Ruxana, fully understood the scale of. When he died 6 years ago, childless and quietly estranged from most of the family after a falling out over our father's land, he had named me, and only me, as the beneficiary of everything he owned. I never told anyone, not because I wanted to hide wealth, but because grief and money tangled together in ways I didn't know how to explain to a family that was already struggling to see me as anything but a burden. I let the funds sit, managed quietly by Wasim's firm, drawing interest, growing in property value, while I lived simply in the house Ruxana and I built with our own hands. I went to Wasim's office the next morning, without telling anyone where I was going. The numbers he showed me on the screen were larger than I had allowed myself to think about in years. The Sialkot property alone had tripled in value. The Geneva account, after currency conversion, was enough to change several lives. "Uncle, may I ask," Wasim said carefully, "why you never touched any of it?" I thought about Aisha's face that morning, staring at an empty passbook, like it was proof of something. "Because money changes how people look at you," I said, and I wanted to know who my family really was. Without it, he didn't press further. He simply asked me to sign, and I did, my hands steady, despite everything churning beneath the surface. When I returned home that evening, the house was tense in a different way. Aisha was on the phone with her cousin, describing, in a tone somewhere between apology and embarrassment, how her father didn't really have much saved, and how they were figuring out the guest room situation. I stood in the doorway and listened until she noticed me and hung up quickly, her cheeks reddening. "Dad, how long were you standing there?" "Long enough," I said gently, and went to my room without another word. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was hurt. Hurt had long since worn smooth like a river stone, but because I was deciding something important. I thought of Ruxana, of what she would have wanted. She always believed people revealed their truest selves not when they had everything, but when they thought someone else had nothing. The following week, Farhan's cousin's family arrived early for the wedding season, and the guest room conversation resurfaced with more urgency. Aisha came to me one evening, unable to meet my eyes. "Dad, I think it might really be best if you stayed with Imran for a while, just until things settle down here." I looked at her for a long moment. "All right," I said simply. I packed a single bag. Zain cried when he saw me leaving, clutching my sleeve and asking why I couldn't stay. I knelt down to his level and told him that sometimes grown-ups need a little space to think, and that it had nothing to do with how much I loved him. He didn't fully understand, but he let go, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I stayed with Imran for 11 days. In that time, Wasim finalized the transfer of the Sialkot property into my name, fully liquid and ready to be used however I chose. I visited the site myself, acres of land now bordered by a growing industrial zone, worth far more than even Wasim's estimates. Standing there, I thought about the small radio and clock shop I used to run, the one Zane always asked about, and an idea began to take shape. On the 12th day, I asked Wasim to help me draft something else entirely. Not a will, not a transfer, but an invitation. I called a family meeting, the kind we hadn't held since Ruxana's funeral. Aisha looked surprised when I asked her to gather everyone, including Farhan's parents, in the living room of the house I had technically been asked to leave. "Dad, what is this about?" she asked, uncertainty flickering across her face. I sat at the head of the table, the same seat I'd sat in for 30 years, and placed a folder in front of me. "I want to tell you about your Uncle Tariq," I began, "and about a shop I'm going to open for your son." The room went silent. I explained everything. Tariq's business, the trust, the Geneva account, the Sialkot land now sold to a logistics company for a figure that made Farhan visibly pale. I explained that none of it had ever been about hiding wealth from them, but about wanting, just once in my life, to know whether I was loved for who I was, rather than what I had. "You let us think," Aisha started, her voice breaking. "I let you show me who you were," I said, not unkindly. "And now I know." Farhan looked down at his hands, unable to speak. His parents shifted uncomfortably, suddenly recalculating every comment they'd made about the old man in the guest room. I told them my plan. A portion of the funds would go toward Zane's education, held in a trust he couldn't touch until adulthood. Another portion would fund a small business, the radio and clock shop, reimagined as a modern electronics repair shop that Zane could grow into one day, exactly as he'd dreamed on the porch that night. The rest I intended to use quietly, on my own terms, in my own home, which I would be buying back the deed to myself, outright, that same week. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I told them, watching the weight of shame settle over the room. "I'm doing this because your mother taught me that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need to prove anything, but I also won't spend what remains of my life being someone's inconvenience." Aisha cried harder than I'd seen her cry since the funeral. "I'm so sorry, Dad. We were so wrong about you." "You weren't wrong about me," I said quietly. "You were wrong about what mattered." In the months that followed, things slowly healed, not because of the money, but because the truth had cleared away years of quiet resentment neither of us had known how to name. Aisha visited more often, this time asking about my day instead of my finances. Farhan, humbled, helped me set up the shop's first inventory system, working late into the evenings without ever mentioning what it might one day be worth. And Zane, still too young to understand trusts and property deeds, simply loved coming to the shop after school, sitting behind the counter beside me, fixing old radios with small, careful hands. I never told them the full number in that Geneva account, and I never will. Some things are mine to keep quiet, the way my patience always was. What I gave them instead was something I believe mattered more: the chance to see, clearly and painfully, who they had become, and the grace to become someone better.